very critical unit that is called African Christian Theology. African Christian Theology. I taught you Systematic Theology 1, where we discussed issues like the sources of theology. We looked at the definition of theology, theos and logos, the study about God. We looked at systematic theology, where it's arrangement of the biblical message into topics. We discussed the sources. We looked at Christology. We looked at soteriology. We looked at the theology of God proper. We looked at salvation. We looked at providence, theodicy. We discussed issues of creation. You remember creation ex nihilo. That God created the world out of nothing. Very good. It's a Latin word. From there, we went to systematic theology 2. And we looked at pneumatology. If you may remember, it is the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. We looked at ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church. And also we proceeded to look at eschatology, the doctrine of the end times. You remember I told you that I wrote my PhD thesis is on life after death. It's called the intermediate state of death. A place where the souls stay from the time of death to resurrection. That teaching was very good. We discussed theology. But sometimes the theology by Wilbur O. Odovan. Sometimes the theology of Wayne Grudem. Sometimes the theology of Miller J. Erickson is irrelevant in our context. Because it does not address real issues in our context. We have issues of FGM. You remember something called female genital mutilation, as they say it. Theology of the West, that is orthodox and biblical, but it is irrelevant in dealing with real African issues. The issues of Tumin, the initiation rites. Do we do it the Christian way, or do we do it the traditional way? These are issues that cannot be discussed in systematic theology. That's why there is a need and a rationale for us to study African Christian theology. Why? It addresses real issues in the African context. It scratches where it aches. It deals with the real existential issues. It seeks to make theology relevant to the African context. And I want to begin by saying that who should do African theology? Who should be the architects of African theology? Some people say that the architects of African Christian theology should be black people. And I want to tell you, when we talk about black African Christian theology, we do not discuss the theology of the church in the early times. Because we have churches that were existed in Africa from the early times. We have the Ethiopian Coptic Church. We have the Ethiopian Coptic Church. The Ethiopian Coptic Church existed from the time of the Ethiopian Union. It has existed. We have the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the Egyptian Coptic churches. These churches have existed since the first church during the time of the apostolic church. When we talk about African Christian theology, we do not discuss about those churches. Number two, we do not discuss the theology in North Africa, which is exclusively Muslim. When we talk about African Christian theology, we discuss the theology and the reflection of the church in the last 150 years. And we talk about the black Africa, really south of Sahara. And the question comes, who should do African theology? Ni nani anastahili kufanya theolojia ya Kiafrika? Some people say it should be done by black people only. But I believe the more sensible position is somebody who has lived in Africa, attained an African worldview, like Wilbur O. Odovan. He's a white man. He's a white man of Zungu, but he has lived in Africa. He has interacted with others, with Africa, and I believe that we should complement each other. The native blacks, and even people who can assist us so that we can discuss African Christian theology. Allow me to go to the definitions. You can pen it down. According to John Kurewa, African theology is the study. African theology is the study that seeks to reflect upon. It seeks to reflect upon and express the Christian faith. It seeks to reflect upon and express the Christian faith in African thoughts and idioms. It expresses the faith in African thoughts and idioms as it is experienced by African Christian communities, as it is experienced in African Christian communities in dialogue with the rest of the Christian world. So it is expressing Christianity in African thoughts, in African idioms, in African color and expression. You remember when the white man came and he taught us how to sing with a piano. You remember, oh, no, sing, praise is so foreign. But you see, when Rose is at home, and even Mama when he's at home, you see that song, you see when you speak in English, it goes to the head. But when you speak in your mother tongue, it goes straight into the heart. Therefore, the African Christianity has to be incarnated in Africa, in African thoughts, idioms, and in African color. That's why we need African Christian theology. Are we together? We need to express it. It is the theological expression, according to Mithi. It is the theological expression by African Christians. It is the theological, African theology is the theological expression of, is the theological reflection and expression by African Christians. That is African Christian theology. It is something that is within, and it is something that is here with us. It is, African theology is contextual biblical theology. It is called contextual biblical theology. It is a theology that deals with the context of Africa. It is a theology that should have two components. It should be authentically biblical and authentically African. So African Christian theology must have these two characteristics. It must be truly biblical. That means it should not have syncretism. Syncretism is a mixture, a mishmash, a mixture of African beliefs and the Bible without separating or segregating. It becomes almost the heretical syncretism. But when you do authentic African theology, you must be authentically biblical. Why? You remember the Bible is the ultimate source of authority in all matters of orthodoxy and practice. But it must not only be authentically biblical, it must be authentically African. Christianity is very different from Islam. Islam, when you adapt Islam, you shift and you become almost Arabic. It comes with its culture. The way you slaughter the animal is prescribed. The way you go wherever is prescribed. But in Christianity, Christianity is always, according to Laurenti Magesa, Christianity is always pregnant, ready to be born in any culture it's planted in. What am I trying to say? It takes that form and the shape of that particular culture. You'll find that Christianity, there is what we call these days global Christianity. In global Christianity, we look at the diverse expressions of Christianity. And I want to say there is no form of Christianity that is more Christian than the other, so long as it is authentically biblical and authentically relevant to that context. Now, African Christian theology speaks to the soul of the African. It deals with the real African issues. And according to Charles Nyamiti, African theology may be defined as discourse of God in the mentality and the needs of the black continent. It's the study of God, discourse on God, according to the mentality and the needs of people in the black continent. That is according to Charles Nyamiti. In fact, he wrote extensively on Christ, the supra ancestor. By the way, when you go during your break or whatever time you have, go and look at my article by Kimutai Jesus. I wrote on Christ, the supra ancestor. Look at this. Is it a biblical theology? Because I looked at Christ, there is the African worldview. Among things that are big in our African worldview, number one, community. I am because you are, and since you are, I am. Number two, the concept of God. There is no African who is an atheist. We believe in the supreme being. That is by general revelation. We believe that God indeed does exist. We believe in God. Number two, we believe in life after death. And the concept of the ancestor looms large in the African context. Therefore, I looked at the concept of the ancestor and I brought it to the African understanding and I formulated an African Christology that is entitled Christ the supra ancestor. Christ the bigger ancestor, beyond the ancestor. And it is a theology that you can identify with. Because Africans, the ancestor is the ancestor, and people who have gone to the intermediate state are venerated. They are respected. In fact, they were intermediaries between God and us. You remember in the African worldview, God, the supreme being, Assis, and Cheptalel. God, the supreme being, Wele Kahaba, Wele Mugobe, Ngai. He was high and exalted. And sometimes he was too transcendent. He did not deal with real issues. But they were ancestors who were divinities. And they were intermediaries. That concept could be easily brought to explain Christ to the African so that Christ can understand. Then there were these religious practitioners who are the third type. The first one was God, the divinities, the traditional practitioners, then the common mwananchi. Now let's look at the origin and development of African Christian theology. In 1956, how many of you were born in 1956? 1956. Kuna yote alikuwa amezaliwa? I doubt there was none. Me, I was born, how many years later? I was born 22 years later. In 1956, Catholic priests in Rome, Catholics sometimes are very bright. After the Vatican II, the Catholics embraced inculturation, while some of us were condemning it as demonic. But they embraced inculturation, making the Bible relevant. You remember people like Placidia Temples, who are considered as forerunners. They formulated what we call Ubuntu philosophy. And they thought that there is something good in the African. 1956, some African priests who are training in Rome. Among them, there is somebody by the name of Mulago. There is somebody by the name of Kagame. There is somebody by the name of Mvenge. They met in Rome. Na vile walikutana naye, when they met in Rome, they published several articles entitled Des Pretos Nor Si Interrogates. It is French, they are Francophone. But they were talking about making Christianity relevant to the African culture. The preface of their article was written by a person who was the Archbishop of Dakar, Senegal. It's called Lefebvre. And he talked to them. And he said that we need to contextualize some of the rituals like burials and marriages. We need to make them relevant in the African context. Later, in the 1960s, there was great debate in the University of Kinshasa in Zaire. There was a very great debate between somebody by the name of Mulago and another one by the name of Van Este. Professor Van Este was a European, and he was advocating for universal theology. But this other man, by the name of Mulago, was advocating for an African theology. These debates continued up to 68. They were trying to find the basis and the rationale for African Christian theology. And later, we find that other people joined in the fray. Bishop Lucas of Musaki, Tanzania, he advocated for Christianization of African religious beliefs and practice. So you find that most of these churches began to embrace the need and the reality of making Christianity relevant to the African context and African situation. You remember somebody by the name of Henry Sawyer. He published an important book on creative evangelism. In 1969, Bishop Paul visited Uganda. And when he visited Uganda, he challenged people to make Christianity relevant to the African context. There was a formation of AACC, All African Council of Churches. These are the events that really propagated people to begin to think about African Christian theology. There is also another scholar called A.A. Shorter. He wrote a book entitled African Christian Theology, Adoption or Inculturation. And so many symposiums and conferences by theologians, people began to have discussion and debate on African Christian theology. Now let's look at there was a conference in Accra, Ghana in 1976. And what did they discuss about African Christian theology? You can note the context of African theology. What is the context of African theology? It's African culture that is dominated by the West. Why do we need to do African theology? Because our culture is dominated by the West. Now, let's look at the trends of doing African Christian theology. One, there are those who believe that African traditional religion was preparatio evangelii. Do you know what they mean? Preparatio evangelii is a Latin word that means preparation for the gospel. Some people equate the African culture with the Old Testament. that they are at par. God was preparing us with our culture that is so rich and diverse, that God is so present. God was preparing us to receive the gospel. That is one view we are going to discuss later. Do you believe they are right or wrong? Number two, there are people who look at critical theology. Critical theology. Critical theology is open to dialogue with other non-Christian, with other non-African theologies. Like it borrows from Latin American liberation theology. It borrows from all that. Now let's look at the third one is the black theology of South Africa. The other one is critical, it borrows, and then there is the black theology of South Africa. Now, let's look at the sources of African Christian theology. What sources are we going to use as we study African Christian theology? Number one, of course, as good Christians, the Bible is a source of African Christian theology and the Christian heritage, including the tradition and even reason that we have. Number two, African anthropology. African anthropology and worldview. African way of looking at things. Let me give you a perfect example when you are an African. When you are an African, how you look at things, really and practically. When you, according to the African, reading in it, what is standard? Ni jogo is a concrete. That is African. African from a song about PhD, but he still thinks that this lightning is concrete. As an African understand. Number two, ukifagia uchafu usiku, where do you throw it? At night, what do you do with uchafu umefagia kwa nyumba? Where do you place it? Kwa nini usitupe nje? Why not throw it outside? Baraka wakati mwingine ni siafu ndio inaleta tu, lakini Mwafrika in his thinking, when you sweep it outside, you are going to forfeit your blessings. Angalia hata kama mtoto wa kwanza wa Rose ni kijana. Ukienda safari and you are from the Luya community. Ukiamuka tu safari asubuhi. Who are you supposed to meet first in your safari comes? A man. So African way of thinking, ukiamuka asubuhi Rose anaamuka anataka kutembea. Na anaona mtu wa kwanza ni lady, anarudi nyuma amesahau kitu. Alafu arudi tena kwa barabara. Akutane na mwanaume, safari itakuwa mzuri. So there is a one African worldview. It's very real. African, the way we understand reality. Wazungu, mtu akikuwa mwendazimu, what do you think is the problem? Mzungu anasema this is purely psychiatric case. What about Africa? No, there are some spirit. There are some spirits that needs to be exorcised. It needs to be banished. Na hata ukienda kwa Lejo Maria wanapiga mtu viboko mpaka mapepo inatoka yote. They have very strong understanding on demon possession and exorcism. Number three, African traditional religion is a very critical source. African independent churches like African Divine Church, you have African Israel Church, we name it. Have you ever gone and attended one of these independent churches? How many of you have attended an independent church service? I have attended once when we were in college. I had listened to 6 sermons before the service ended. Na iko posho watu watakula vizuri. And you know, in African independent churches, everybody has a position. Kila mtu ana cheo kwa kanisa. Mwingine ni mama Jumatano, mwingine ni mama Jumatatu, mwingine mama Salasini, mama Arobaini, mama Alhamisi. And everybody is important because these people were downtrodden in the society. They were mostly laborers. And they did not have any sense of importance. Until this church came with a solution, everybody should have a position. And everybody is happy. You will go where you are coming from. Everybody wants to be a canon or something. You'll understand everybody wants to be happy and to be recognized. You have to give everybody a position in the church. That is another source. The other one is African reality. African reality is a source that include forms of life and arts, even songs. Extended family. In fact, it can be a very good illustration of a church, ecclesia, extended family, hospitality, communal life, and things like that. Now, let's look at three forms of African Christian theology. Three forms. One is contextual. For a theology to be African, number one, it must be contextual theology. It must be contextual. It must deal with reality in the African context. Number two, it must be liberation. It connects with other third world theology. Like we are going to look at Latin American liberation theology. It talks about God's favor of the poor. It must, number three, it must struggle against sexism, the discrimination of women in theology, and even in the church. What percentage of women exist in our church? Sangha, in your church, percentage of mama ni kama ngapi? 70%. Those are the people who are facilitating the church. But when you look at their percentage in lay leaders, what is the percentage of women in lay leaders and priests? Priests, maybe less than 10%. Women, or 20 when you are mengangana sana. But why exclude women and they are the majority in the church? And we have men talking to them, and sometimes men are irrelevant when you talk about African women liberation. Some people tie ordination to masculinity. But I want to say that masculinity is only related to family affairs. Maybe it has nothing to do with ministry. Masculinity is not an essential part of ministry. It's not an inherent part of ministry. So we talk about African women liberation theology. We distinguish it from feminist theology. Feminism is distinct. Even the patriarch or the matriarch or the doyen of African Christian theology. You can go and Google a person by the name or a lady by the name of Reverend Mercy Amba Oduyoye. Mercy Amba Oduyoye, Nigerian, Ghanaian, married in Nigeria, an Anglican priest. He defended the place of women in ministry. And for us in the church, we have to rise beyond masculinity that has emasculated the church and made women who should have made impact and contribution to be buried in the peripheries of our churches. Therefore, we look at that. And let me look at some of the aspirations. What aspires us? What inspires us to do African Christian theology? What inspired the formulation of African Christian theology? The outcry for political independence. It began at the time of independence. That's where people decide for an African Christian theology. Number two, education. When people were more educated, they appreciated their culture better. They appreciated their culture. So the other thing is that the church in Africa in the 1900s began to have Africans leading those churches. So when Africans were leading, there was need for an African theology. And some of the evangelists broke ranks with their superiors. Like Elijah Masinde Namen, he was a Friend's man. He was a Quaker preacher, but he married a second wife. What happened? He bolted out of the Friends' church and started his dini himself. The other thing is that the translation of the Bible into vernacular. When people read the Bible in their own language, they discovered, oh, some people were polygamous. Oh, Nameme said, no. These Wazungus are interpreting the Bible wrong. Number 4, there were Western theologians who were sympathetic to African initiated churches. AIC, African initiated churches. The other thing is the movement of Pan-Africanism and African nationalism. There was need for the church to be self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating, and self-theologizing. That's why there was need for African Christian theology. And people are fighting for the independence. They also needed religious independence. Why do we justify African Christian theology? One, because the theologians of the West were answering questions that were irrelevant. Nobody was asking them. Have you ever heard a theologian by the name of Bultmann? Rudolf Bultmann. Rudolf Bultmann. According to Rudolf Bultmann, the Jesus that is in the Bible is not the historical Jesus. He created somebody called the historical Jesus and the Jesus of faith. The historical Jesus, according to Rudolf Bultmann, who denies miracles. He denies miracles, and he said the Bible is pre-scientific. It needed to be interpreted in scientific times. And Rudolf Bultmann, he said things like Jesus resurrected, those are fiction and myth. We need to make the Bible be relevant to our culture and our context. So Rudolf Bultmann created a historical Jesus, a man who lived, he married maybe, he died, but the disciples, after he died, created a fictitious Jesus of faith who performed all these miracles. Is that theology relevant to the African context? No, it is irrelevant. Who asked him, who told Bultmann that we needed a historical Jesus? He created it. And some of the African theologians who go to the West, sometimes they learn all this and they begin to talk about a very irrelevant theology. Number 2, Christianity needed to be rooted in Africa. Therefore, there was need for an African Christianity, an African theology. Number 3, there is the challenge of integrity. Challenge of integrity. What is the challenge? People are preaching water and drinking wine. So there was the inconsistency between what people said and what people did. So if there was inconsistency, they needed a theology that was popular but also academic. We needed to have an African theology. There are issues that are African, like eradication of colonialism, neo-colonialism. That's why we needed these theology. Number 3, African traditional religion refused to die. It refused to die. Even this traditional circumcision, the church was celebrating that it is going to be kaput. They were saying by the year 2000, Cheptilet will be over. But they were dead wrong. It is back with a force. Do you know Mugiki? They thought that Kikuyu culture will be dead and completely buried. But as I went to Nakuru the other day, they said there is a group that is very cultural among the Kikuyus. They have gone back to the roots. So you cannot wish away our culture. We need a theology. And we need to do African Christian theology. What are the tasks? What are the tasks of African Christian theology? Can you tell me what are the tasks of African Christian theology? Number one, to address practical and pastoral issues in the African context. The issue of concubining. Do you know concubining? Mpango wa kando is an African reality. It needs to be addressed. We need to address the issue of polygamy. If a person is polygamous, what do you do? What do you do? You chase him from the church? Or you just receive his offerings and deny him the rest of the things? We need a theology to address these issues. Let's not bury our heads in sand. Practical and pastoral issues that needs to be addressed. We need to address the distorted African worldview. Some people thought that Africans were half children, half devils. That Africans are people without understanding. We need to address that distorted view. We need to address renewal in worship by incorporating the African flavor into our music and even into our worship. The late Archbishop, the most Reverend Dr. David Gitari. The new liturgy that we are using right now was a product of African Christian theology. There is a lot that is borrowed from Africa, especially these litania. It's very African. King for the king, king, sere for the sere. You see, it's very African. Why don't we do it in tongues? It's not sinful. Hata in marriage, why don't we have such wakati watu wameombewa, wamefunganishwa ndoa, wanasema usigiza, wasae. And you give them blessings and people are very excited. Why? It is Christian and it is African. If somebody abuses you in your mother tongue, and the other person abuses you in English, which one will you be more offended? Why? It goes straight to your heart. Ukiona watu kutoka upande ile kama huyu Katila Yunis wakiimba wewe kama ya You see, people are excited. And somebody was telling me that mtu alikuwa excited anaonesha mnyama ambaye anakula. Kina roast ni hapo because they take chicken. Maybe he was telling me a funny story. But what am I trying to put across is that we need the renewal of liturgy. Number 3, we need sermons that are relevant to the African situation and context. We need to address ethical issues. Ethical issues. There are many ethical issues. Kama kukunywa pombe, kuvuta tobacco, naitanga tapa nyongo, tapa ni tobacco. We need to address those issues. And when we address those issues, we need African Christian theology. We need to bridge the gap between two kinds of theology: academic and popular theology. We need to bridge this gap. Academic theology ni ile ambayo iko what we are doing now is academic. Popular theology is the one that treats preachers wanahubiri. Who is relevant between the academic theologian and the popular preacher? Who is relevant? The popular. He addresses real issues. Kama siku hizi chenye wana address ni shida ya wanaume. I don't know what is the problem ya wanaume. But ukienda hata mganga wa mitishamba, he knows. Daktari mashuhuri kutoka Kitui anatibu kitu cha kwanza, shida ya wanaume. Can all men tell me what is your problem? But anyway, that mganga is more relevant, he understands. But here in the college, sometimes we don't talk about things that are relevant. We are biblical, but irrelevant. When you go and preach these things peke yake without incorporating into African reality and the African context, you become a very irrelevant priest. And we need to deal with social justice. And denominationalism we need to address is an issue that has impacted negatively on Christianity. And we need to understand the relationship between Christianity and African and non-Christian religion. We have just talked generally about sources. But let me look at it in depth. The Bible is a source. Church tradition is a source. African religion and philosophy. African religion and philosophy is a source. African revelations. We'll look at theology that is oral, and we are going to look at sermons by African preachers and non-African preachers, African Christian life and African liturgy, translation of the Bible into vernacular, and the historical churches and independent churches. Now, for me to conclude this first session before we go for a break, I want us to look at definitions of Christian theological terminologies. Definitions. The first one that I'm going to look at is inculturation. Inculturation. This is the insertion of the Christian life and message into a particular culture. When the Christian life and message is imparted into a particular culture, this is what we call inculturation. So when it comes in the exams, do not be surprised. It is called inculturation. Number two, we have what we call, this is the insertion of the Christian life and message into a particular culture. It's called inculturation. The second one is interculturation. Interculturation. It implies mutual influence. Do you know the meaning of the word mutual? Mutual influence. They influence one another. When people stay together, they influence one another, especially when they marry. Maruti was married in Kalenjin land. She now knows how to prepare music, na saa zingine mzee anajua kukula mshebebe, because they have mutually influenced one another. Interculturation means mutual influence between the Christian message and the culture in which it is inserted. Christianity is influenced by the culture, and the culture is influenced by Christianity. And you find interculturation. Number three, interculturation is here. Number three is what we call acculturation. Acculturation. This is the encounter between cultures. It is understood as the study of the cultural transmission in process. When culture encounter one another, it's called acculturation. Then I'm going to look at another term that is called enculturation. Enculturation. Enculturation is where people learn their own culture. When you learn your own culture, it is called enculturation. The other word is indigenization. It is living and expressing the gospel message in accordance with a particular cultural tradition. Living and expressing the gospel according to a particular cultural tradition. Then, indigenization, there is a better term that is called contextualization. Indigenization is a bit rigid, but contextualization is living and expressing the Christian message in terms of a particular cultural context. In terms of a particular cultural context, it is more dynamic. It acknowledges the fact that culture is dynamic and ever changing. It acknowledges that culture is dynamic and ever changing. The other term is Africanization. Living and expressing the gospel message in accordance with the African traditional culture. That's what we call Africanization. Lastly, incarnation. It is expressing Christianity by living within that particular culture, just as Christ did. He incarnated and he lived according to that particular culture. I think we have done so much today. We have looked at the basics, at the rudimentary. We have looked at the aspirations. We have looked at the history of the formulation of African Christian theology. We have looked at critical definitions. We have looked at resources. And I want us to take a short break. Then as we come back, we are going to have a discussion on the same. I'll be free to ask me questions. Then later, we will proceed and look at the trends of African Christian theology. May the Lord richly bless you as you become good African Christian theology, without which you will be irrelevant. Thank you and God bless you.